only women panel, and now we are doing a next step. So this is only women panel plus queer. And we are going to have, I hope, not only a presentation, but some moment of exchange. My name is Valentina, and I work for APC, the Association for Progressive Communication, the Women's Rights Program. And we are part of a network that is called Erotics. And Erotics try to understand and explore the connection between sexuality and the internet. The research that you will hear are a work of almost 2 years done in India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka by 3 wonderful organizations and more than those 3 wonderful individuals that you see here. And the idea is to start having, collecting and presenting some baseline, how sexual rights activists, women's rights activists, LGBT people use the internet, what they experience once they are in internet, what are their strategy, what are their concerns. And these are the 2 research in Nepal and in Sri Lanka. It's the first time that a research like this happened. While India is it's going to talk about a specific piece of legislation, the Section 67 of the Information Act. And I will just invite Bishaka from Point of View to start with this. I think you have seen already. The title is very attractive, The Gavas and the Genitals.
Thank you, Vale. So before I start, I also want to introduce my colleague Smita Vaniyar, who's in the audience and is part of the research and is helping with the presentation. Okay, since we all have very short sort of times to present, I'm just going to go right into it. The Guavas and the Genitals is actually a research study looking at one section of the Information Technology Act in India, which is Section 67, or the provision that regulates obscenity in the digital domain. The way we did the study was actually through numerous methodologies, not just through 99 cases. But what we did was we looked at the history of this particular provision, which goes all the way back to 1860 and the colonial period in India. We looked at its offline counterpart in the Indian Penal Code and found that both the online and the offline are very, very similar in wording. We also looked at data from the National Crime Records Bureau, but the reason we have 99 cases up here is a chunk of our analysis of the way in which Section 67 is currently being used comes from looking at media coverage of 99 cases in India in the last 3 years, 2015, 2016, 2017. These 4 words have been put up because these are the 4 defining words around obscenity in Section 67. So according to the section, something is deemed obscene if it is lascivious, prurient, depraved, if it tends to deprave or corrupt. And I think you see the long arm of sort of colonization here in the use of language, which frankly, none of our policemen or policewomen, many of whom English is not their first language, nobody can understand what these words mean, right? So it's really a colonial era sort of legislation stretching out to now, both in terms of concept and language, and also, let's keep in mind that in 1860, when the physical version of this was framed, but which has exactly the same 4 words, there was no internet, there was no video, photography had barely come in. So it's something that's really stretching out across time, and we are not sure it applies anymore. Okay. We'll just give you a few examples of how it's being used currently. This is actually a Snapchat dog filter that was used on our Prime Minister. And this was used by a comedy group in India. And they were booked by the police for obscenity, as well as for criminal defamation. Now, I want you to leave aside the individual question of whether this constitutes objectionable material or not. That is another subjective thing. But if we think of those 4 words, lascivious and prurient, which relates to sort of arousing sexual interest, I think it's somewhat hard to argue that this can be called obscene, right? And so we feel that this is just one of many cases that we've seen, which shows how this application is being misapplied. The second image is actually a very different kind of case. This is from a campaign called Shame the Rapists, which is a 2015 campaign. And what we are seeing in India and many other countries perhaps is that nowadays when there are cases particularly of gang rapes, the person who is raped is often also filmed while being raped, which are called rape videos, and then these rape videos are circulated. And we think of it as 3 violations of consent, right? The rape itself, the filming, as well as the distribution. There is actually a provision in the Information Technology Act called Section 66E to deal with cases of rape videos, which punishes the capture or transmission of private parts without consent. So cases like this can actually be filed under that, but again, are being filed mainly as obscenity. And we feel, again, very strongly from a women's rights perspective, that this takes away a woman, like if it's a woman in this situation, it takes away her agency, her consent, etc., and mutates that into obscenity, and that's a serious problem. The reason this visual is there is that this is actually the visual from the campaign where the person who ran the campaign actually took out the images of the young men who were raping somebody in this particular video and circulated it online, and it led to them being actually apprehended by the cops. But this is the second thing, like consent becomes obscenity, yeah, and that's a problem. And this is, again, just one other example, and this, again, is the photograph that you see is actually of 3 people on a yacht. This is the chief minister of the state in which I live, Maharashtra, and his family. They had gone on a holiday, and somebody on Twitter put out a tweet saying, hey, there's a drought in our state, and our chief minister is lolling around on a yacht, right? So again, of course, it was a political comment. It was taking him to task. But again, if we apply words like lascivious and prurient, it is almost impossible to understand how this particular image qualifies as something that is obscene. So we don't have the time to really go into too many other cases. But I think, do we end here, Smita? Yeah, so these are 3 examples of how this particular section is being misused. And then the last one, and then I'll stop, is actually a case of a young woman who encountered online harassment. Is there a visual? Okay, I can't see it from here. That's why I'm confused. Okay. So she encountered a lot of online harassment. One part of the online harassment related to getting sexually explicit texts. And that was the part that was booked as obscenity. But that, again, I think begs the larger question, which is what is to be done about the totality of online harassment? And once again, can obscenity essentially now become sort of a whipping boy or a dustbin in which we place all sorts of actual harms, ranging from violations of consent to online harassment to morphing, as well as things that are not necessarily harms at all, like political comment, etc. Or how do we deal with the misuse of this kind of provision? Thank you.
Thanks, Bishaka. You see how we are well organized to make sure that some of you can have some comments, suggestion at the end, maybe question. It's a 30 minutes run against time. So it's a very interesting new way of understanding obscenity. It's a completely new field. And it's, I think it's important to understand that the place and the space, the context and the framework. Why this little word, obscenity, can be the magic word that can silence anything, even when there is no really any remote linkage with anything that is possibly remotely sexual, which is already something that we can discuss why should be blocked. Now we move to Sancha from the Women's and Media Collective, the research done in Sri Lanka, to hear what we had learned there together with our partner.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you for having me. Just to take you through some of the objectives of the research that we did, we were looking at how the online space and services are being utilized, what the limitations and the restrictions faced online, and the key policy reforms that could improve the conditions of use and enjoyment of the online space, specifically for LGBT Sri Lankans. Just to give you a bit of a background to the present situation, the LGBT Sri Lankans continue to live in secrecy, away from the government contact and beyond reach of community and even apart from each other. This is mainly due to the Penal Code provisions of Section 365 and 365A that criminalizes carnal intercourse against the order of nature, and the second criminalizes acts of gross indecency between persons. An analysis by a leading LGBT organization says that this is a tool to target and harass the LGBT community. The report provides a concrete example of such surveillance in Sri Lanka, in how the police consider themselves authorized to arrest gender non-conforming people in the likelihood of engaging in such acts. On the other hand, there's also Section 399 of the Penal Code, which makes it an offense to cheat by personation. A person is said to cheat by personation if he pretends to be some other person or by knowingly substituting one person for another. The police are said to arrest transgender people under this law. So looking at sexuality and the online space in Sri Lanka, there were many aspects which our research covered, but I just took a few that I thought might be important. Before the internet, the LGBT people had a few sources of information on their own sexual orientation or gender identity. In interviews with LGBT individuals, Mahela, a gay man, recalled how he had believed for a long time that his same-sex sexual attraction was unique and that he was the only person in the world to be going through the experience. He says the discovery of the information was the first step in a process of self-acceptance for him. In contrast, he thinks that how younger LGBT Sri Lankans who have grown up with some access to the internet are less likely to be unaware of homosexuality or transgenderness. Then most platforms on the internet cater predominantly to an English reading audience, with most sources of LGBT related information being foreign to Sri Lanka. Now the main languages in Sri Lanka are Sinhala and Tamil, and there are much less resources available in these languages, and something that caters to the Sri Lankan audience. In terms of information and official sources, there are a few sources that exist. And the National STD AIDS Control Program, the national body in Sri Lanka, who's responsible and implementing STI and HIV prevention and control activities, is the only online source the study could identify as a government source that explicitly recognized LGBT issues. However, the quality of discussions and presentations in the website leaves much to be desired. In a context where LGBT Sri Lankans are silenced and excluded from public discourses, the internet affords them the ability to interrogate and counter prevailing narratives and to work to expand the public's understanding of Sri Lanka's sexual and gender diversity. Mithya, a trans woman participating in the focus group discussion, described how she uses her Instagram account to express what being a trans woman means to her. She uses images of herself to spread the idea that #trans is beautiful, noting that when more people see more images of her expressing her trans identity, the gender impact she can have on normalizing trans people in society, the greater impact rather, she can have on normalizing trans people in society. On the other hand, another gay man participating in the discussion also used social media, especially Facebook, to publicly share LGBT-related content and engage in conversations on LGBT rights in Sri Lanka. On social media, self-censorship extends to the creation and use of anonymous profiles. An important phenomenon among LGBT Sri Lankans is the widespread use of anonymous and pseudonymous profiles to navigate stigma and discrimination on social media. For an analysis of the survey data, all respondents had at least one profile with their real name and images of themselves. If any of them had profiles without their real name or face pictures, such profiles were always in addition to a real profile. Rajesh, a gay man who participated in the focus group, said, "On Facebook, I have two profiles. One is under my given name, which is where I had my family members and friends. But all my friends from the community associate him through a second profile, which is under the short name that everybody knows him by. So if someone from his family adds him on his first profile, he quickly decides to add them on his second profile." A major stumbling block in the use of enjoyment of the internet is the lack of security for content stored and shared on the internet. Another gay man, Deshan, recounted how his private photos of his partner and himself were used in political pages, attacking the sitting prime minister, capturing the photos with questions like, "Do you want your children to be like this?" He said that they used their pictures politically and it went around Facebook, so he removed it. He said he doesn't have a problem with it, but he didn't want it to affect his family and nieces and nephews, and so he had to be careful. He also mentioned that such violations of privacy are carried out even by the community itself and even organizations that work for LGBT rights in Sri Lanka. When talking about adverse online experiences, online harassment is the most frequent form of violence experienced or witnessed by the respondents, while exposing one's sexual orientation or gender identity by using pictures is the second highest response. 23 of the participants have experienced or personally know someone who has experienced violence in the physical world based on online content related to their sexual orientation or gender identity. 48% have experienced or know someone who has experienced outing without their consent, while 16% have experienced or personally know someone who has experienced law enforcement officials checking their digital devices. LGBT Sri Lankans are able to somewhat relatively enjoy freedom on the internet, while the human rights framework in the Constitution guarantees freedom of information, expression, and assembly. There is no right to privacy nor the right to liberty explicitly mentioned in the Fundamental Rights chapter. At Article 12 guarantees equality before the law and equal protection of the law. It's generally regarded a little too broad. The Constitution does not mention sexual orientation or gender identity as a category to be protected from discrimination, even though there are things such as race, religion, and language. There is also a procedural law framework that should be taken into consideration. The Computer Crimes Act provides a specific scheme of offenses such as crimes related to hacking, infecting computers with viruses, unauthorized interception of data, etc. The Section 2 of the Act specifically states that it applies only in relation to the offenses specified in the Act, and subsequent provisions specify a number of investigatory powers. Key examples of such powers are the ability to obtain any information, including subscriber information and traffic data, in the possession of any service provider, and to intercept any wire or electronic communication, including subscriber information and traffic data, at any stage of such communication. Though the general rule is that an investigator may only access such information under a warrant issued by the magistrate, this requirement may be unilaterally passed if an investigator believes that the investigation needs to be conducted urgently or that there is a need to maintain confidentiality. So any police officer in the course of an investigation can exercise powers of arrest, search, or seizure of any information accessible within any premises. When interviewing two government officials, as well as a senior legal officer of an ISP, they noted that subscriber data may be acquired either through an order addressed directly to the ISP or through a request communicated to the ISP through the Telecommunication Regulatory Commission. The approach follows depends on the circumstances of the case, though no clear framework exists to guide the choice of approach. So based on the many levels of weaknesses that exist in these legal frameworks, for surveillance in the country, the online space is significantly vulnerable to arbitrary policing. These impact almost all Sri Lankans, basically all Sri Lankans, but Section 365 and 365A of the Penal Code makes LGBT Sri Lankans far more vulnerable. Thanks.
Thank you, Sansha. So as you have seen, it's interesting how law, instead of being used to serving justice, is just used to serving the power that exists. Can be the police, can be the judge. And we continue in this exploration with Nepal, with the LUM, which is going to introduce two research, the main research, and a second one that was born by the first one for going deep into a specific subject. And Jyotsna will say us more.
Thank you, Vali. Hi, I'm Jyotsna, and I'm from Nepal, and this is the first time we're doing such a research, and it's been a very exciting and new experiences for us, and my team member, Siva, is also here with me. The whole idea of this research was to understand and explore how women's rights activists and sexual rights activists use the internet to promote or exercise sexual rights and sexual expression, but also to understand the use and perception of the internet. And the third thing is the strategies that they would use to address online harassment or any kind of cyberbullying. Just to give you a bit of a data about Nepal is 17.2% of the 28 million population only have access to the internet, while the Nepal Telecommunication Authority boasts of 51%, but we don't really think it's true because it's only it's only the number of the SIM card holders, and as a SIM card holder, I have like 20 SIM cards. So my number of users would actually go to 20. The second thing is e-commerce has grown over the years, and a lot of young people are engaged in businesses around with Facebook. And the government has also increased its presence on the internet that has introduced electronic services such as passport application and other vital registration. Likewise, the majority of the internet access in Nepal is through data on mobile phones, and the household internet access is only 8.9 penetration. So basically, our research was guided by three important components. The first one was the use and perception of the internet. The second is understanding of sexual rights and sexual expression. And the third aspect is basically on, sorry, I'm just so technical glitch. And the third one is basic risk and strategies. So our methodology was both quantitative and qualitative, with 99 respondents on online survey and 27 key informant interviews and 4 focus group discussions. The major discussions were done with women's rights activists who were established, young women's rights activists who called themselves as the young explorers, and definitely LGBT communities with a lot of gay men were a part of the discussions, and that also made us realize that the people who were a part of the discussion were basically from elite gay groups. So they were able to express a lot of thoughts on sexual expression online, but we couldn't really go into outside Kathmandu because of the limitations. Some of the key findings that we found within our research are basically within the legal context. In all the countries that we had shared is obscene and harmful content are basically regulated, and it's one of the key approaches which is employed by the government to suppress sexuality too. The Public Offence Act, which is also a part of our penal code, is used to limit a wide range of behavior, and obscenity is one of the key terms which is used by the state to restrict freedom of expression. Nepal has a new constitution in September 2015. So the Article 17 and 19 of our constitution ensures freedom of expression and opinion and right to communication as a fundamental human rights. But then it also imposes restrictions on anything which may be contrary to public morality and decency. While we don't have a cyber criminal bill, we have the Electronic Transaction Act, which was a part of banking transactions, but it has elements of criminal acts as well. But it criminalizes publication and display of any materials which may be contrary to public morality or decent behavior. And the question here is, who defines what is a moral behavior and a public behavior? Now, among the experiences of the human rights advocate, LGBT activist, women's rights activist, we found out that everyone felt that internet is a very gendered space, and it's entrenched in heteronormative biases. So basically, the whole understanding is whatever happened offline is actually manifestation online. And that was the experiences in terms of surveillance, in terms of monitoring, is the way we are surveilled as women offline is the way we are tracked online as well. So there is really no demarcation, but given the fluidity of the perpetrators online, it was very difficult to track them. The other key thing was the impact of mental health. Since I am sort of merging two research, the second research on online violence, actually a lot of respondents felt that while they're able to express themselves online, the offline mental violence has really sort of push them not to enter the online space for a very long time because they feel like there is no space for them to be safe. The offline space is similar, and you try to claim the public space, which is the internet, the digital space, and you feel the same way. So these were some of the experiences that they had shared. And 52% of the respondents have been subjected to some forms of online violence. Some of the young activists felt they had their own privacy settings, they had their own support group online, so they could talk to each other and share their problems and, and find basic ways to deal with it. A lot of established women's organizations were very critical of young women activists using the internet in terms of they had these terms that, they need to be careful, they need to be preventive, they should not be using posts, which might bring them trouble. So there's also a generation gap too. The other thing we also found out that for a lot of young women's rights activists, there is no space for them to talk about sexuality and sexual expression because most of the formal spaces, the physical spaces, are basically catered to married women. So you want to talk about sexual health and sexuality, you go to a healthcare center, it basically gives information to married women. So where do they go? So the internet is one space which they have claimed as a space to talk about it. Some of the other experiences was with the LGBT population, they feel like, the activism, the exploration of sexuality has actually been online because the offline space is not very, not safe, but it's not very conducive for them to find partners. So basically dating, relationship, information is actually done through online. So yeah, that's about it. And we'll be launching our research at IGF Nepal next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyotsna. Thank you, everyone. I know that it's formally 4:30, but I hope that we have space if someone has a common thing, an urgent thing to be said. We are happy. Otherwise, we can go down from this wonderful position of power and talk as equal. But I think that it's important to say that the research show that even among the discriminated, there are differences and there are privileges. The fact that certain people among the discriminated community can access or can have a better knowledge, a better data, and can better protect themselves tell us a lot. And I think all this issue about morality, decency, obscenity, and instrumental use of legislation, that goes against the feeling that the internet is a space of freedom. So all the research prove and show how people suffer different form of violence, from the trolling to severe form of violence, but they still feel and think that internet is the space of freedom. And then there are all the other fight. So I think it's really important that we continue to work and to talk about the intersection of sexuality and the internet, and we talk about the power. Power in each and every community. There is no big differences, if not in the grace between the north of the world and the south of the world. The scheme is the same. It's called patriarchy, paternalism, with the heavy implication of colonialism, because we saw in India how those words that come from a different culture are today, in the 2017, put people's lives at risk. Thank you, and if you have question or comment, we can have an equal discussion down the stairs. Thank you. Bye.